Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a close look at a pretty significant document.
Yes, it's called The Art of the Lie, Trump's historic first-year failure on government integrity and accountability issues.
And it comes from the Common Cause Education Fund and the Democracy 21 Education Fund.
Right, these are organizations focused on, government ethics, accountability, nonpartisan.
And their report pulls together research, publicly available info, to really examine these issues.
It's quite comprehensive.
Exactly. So for you listening, our aim here is to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising details or memorable examples from this report.
Yeah, to give you a clear sense of the main arguments about government integrity and accountability during President Trump's first year, without, getting completely overwhelmed by all the detail.
We want to zero in on the core findings, the stuff that really stands out. Okay, so let's unpack this. Right away, the report makes a really bold claim about President Trump's truthfulness.
It does. It kicks things off by describing him as a nonstop, habitual, and compulsive liar. That's pretty direct language.
Very direct. And they attempt to back this up with some data points. They mention a New York Times study.
Right, the one that found demonstrably false statements on at least 20 of his first 40 days.
And also that he apparently said something untrue in public every day for the first 40 days. Just think about that. Every single day.
That consistency, or alleged consistency, is, I think, what the report really emphasizes, the potential impact of that.
And there's more data cited.
Yeah.
A Washington Post analysis covering the whole first year.
Yeah, that one tallied up 2,140 false or misleading claims.
Which averages out to, what, almost 6 a day?
5.9 per day, yeah. Nearly 6 every single day for a year.
And the report doesn't just stick with the numbers, it gives specific examples.
Oh, definitely. They bring up the whole Obama birtherism thing, which persisted.
The claim the U.S. has the highest taxes, which wasn't accurate.
The idea that his own tax reform would cost him a fortune personally.
And comparing his legislative record favorably to Eisenhower's early days.
When, according to the report's analysis, he'd actually signed fewer bills than any president since Eisenhower in that first year time frame.
Fewer, right. Then there's the tax plan itself. He called it the largest tax cut in history.
Repeatedly. The report says 53 times.
But Treasury data cited in the report apparently ranks it 8th.
8th. Yeah, not quite the biggest.
And of course, saying the Affordable Care Act was essentially dead.
Even while it was still very much operational.
The sheer number of examples paints a picture, doesn't it? It wasn't just isolated incidents.
No, and they even point to one specific interview, 30 minutes long, in December 2017.
With the Washington Post, I think.
Where the Post analysis found 24 false or misleading claims.
That's almost one every minute and a quarter.
It's quite the rate. And the report tries to connect this pattern to a broader concern. They bring in a quote from Senator John McCain warning about how autocrats use the term fake news to dismiss criticism and control the narrative.
Suggesting a potentially dangerous parallel.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
And the report wraps up this section by concluding that these lies, this volume of falsehoods, debased facts and truth.
And critically, that this endangered our constitutional system of government. That's their assessment.
Okay, so from truthfulness, the report shifts focus to potential obstruction of justice.
Right. And they start by arguing that obstruction, it doesn't have to be a crime in order to be wrongful. It's about the actions themselves.
An important distinction they make. They then lay out a sequence of events related to the Russia investigation.
Starting with the intelligence community's conclusion in early 2017.
The high-confidence assessment that Russia interfered in the 2016 election.
And that the goal, according to reports they cite, was specifically to help Trump.
That's the context. Then comes the firing of FBI Director James Comey in May 2017.
And the report emphasizes the timing here. Comey was leading the Russia probe.
And this happened after President Trump had reportedly asked Comey for loyalty.
And also asked him, apparently, to drop the investigation into Michael Flynn.
Who, we should remember, later pleaded guilty.
Exactly. And then there's that Oval Office meeting the day after the firing.
With Russian officials.
Where President Trump reportedly called Comey a nut job and said firing him took off great pressure because of Russia.
Which, as reported, sounds like a very direct statement about his motive.
It certainly raised a lot of questions, and ironically, as the report notes, it didn't end the scrutiny.
No, it led directly to the appointment of special counsel Robert Mueller.
Right. And following that appointment, the report details what it calls diversionary tactics and attacks aimed at Mueller's investigation.
Attacks on the Justice Department, the FBI itself.
calling the FBI the worst in history, suggesting a KGB-type operation, even talk of a coup, according to the sources they cite.
A real effort, it seems, described by the report, to undermine the investigation's credibility.
Although, interestingly, the report notes that Miller himself, his integrity, wasn't really challenged directly in the same way.
And finally, on this point,
The report mentions PolitiFact naming the claim that Russian interference was a made-up story as its 2017 lie of the year.
given all the evidence that had emerged.
And the report concludes this section with expressing serious worry about the administration not doing enough to prevent future election interference.
Okay, let's move to the next major theme,
Mm.
the attacks on the judiciary.
Yes. The report frames this as really problematic for the separation of powers, undermining respect for an independent branch of government,
They start with comments made after that NYC terrorist attack in late 2017.
where President Trump called the courts a joke, a laughingstock, and pushed for, quick justice.
Language the report characterizes as more authoritarian than democratic.
And they argue this wasn't a one-off. They point to attacks on specific judges.
The ones who blocked his immigration executive orders.
Exactly. Calling the courts slow and political, blaming a judge personally if something happens.
Saying that judge put the country in peril. That's quite direct.
Very direct. And there was also a White House statement about the sanctuary cities ruling.
Calling it erroneous and a gift to criminals.
Yes. And similar attacks on the court system itself after the DACA injunction.
The report also brings up the pre-election attacks on Judge Curiel.
The judge in the Trump University case, where Trump mentioned his Mexican heritage and implied bias because of the border wall promise.
Which again raises questions about respect for judicial impartiality.
The report's conclusion here is pretty stark, that these repeated attacks chip away at public trust in the rule of law itself.
A fundamental pillar, they argue. Okay, next up, conflicts of interest.
And the report calls these massive and unprecedented.
Because President Trump kept ownership of his businesses while president.
Precisely. Instead of divesting, like past presidents did, he put his assets in a revocable trust run by his sons.
But revocable is the key word there, right? He still benefited financially.
Exactly. He retained the financial interest. The report argues this breaks sharply with precedent set to avoid even the appearance of conflict.
And it potentially opened the door to using the office for personal gain.
That's the report's core argument. And they also raise the emoluments clause of the Constitution,
which is designed to prevent foreign governments from influencing U.S. officials through money or gifts.
Right. And the report suggests his ongoing business dealings, particularly with foreign entities, could violate that clause.
The scale seems notable, too. They mention the Sunlight Foundation tracking.
613 potential conflicts.
Wow. And a USA Today report on real estate sales.
Over $35 million in sales in 2017, many to secretive shell companies, which raises transparency issues.
So the bottom line, according to the report, is that people couldn't know if decisions were made for the country or for his wallet.
That's the fundamental problem they highlight. The lack of transparency breeds that uncertainty and distrust.
And this concern extended to his family members working in the White House.
Yes, the report specifically looks at Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner as senior advisors.
It mentions Kushner having issues with fully disclosing his foreign business contacts.
Repeated failures, the report says, and his use of private email for government work. Plus, operating on an interim security clearance for a long time.
Which security experts apparently found problematic.
Yes, suggesting it should have been suspended pending investigation.
And neither Kushner nor Ivanka Trump fully divested from their businesses.
No. The report cites the Kushner family seeking Chinese investment while he was in his role.
And Ivanka Trump's brand continuing production, often overseas.
And then there's the timing issue, like the Chinese government granting trademarks to her brand.
While Xi and Kushner were meeting with President Xi.
That's what the report highlights. It raises ethical questions, certainly.
Also mentions her frequently wearing her brand's items in social media posts.
Blurring the line, potentially, between public role and private promotion, and a lack of transparency about her company's manufacturing.
So the report concludes these family conflicts were largely what? Ignored.
Essentially, yes. That they didn't receive the scrutiny the report believes they warranted.
Okay, let's pivot to another major campaign theme. Drain the swamp.
Ah, yes. The report's assessment here is, pretty blunt. They argue he failed to do it.
In fact, they say he did the opposite.
That's their claim. that instead of limiting lobbyists' influence, he brought them into the administration.
They cite a Washington Post number.
74 former lobbyists working in the administration within the first 6 months, often regulating industries they used to lobby for.
Can you give some examples the report mentions?
Sure. Michael Flynn lobbying for Turkish interests before and after his short time as national security advisor.
Corey Lewandowski setting up a consulting firm to leverage his access.
Carl Icahn acting as a special advisor while pushing for rule changes that benefited his own companies.
Michael Catanzaro, an energy lobbyist, becoming a top White House energy advisor.
And Chad Wolf, who lobbied the TSA, then became its chief of staff while they were testing tech his old firm pushed.
So the report's take is that the administration wasn't genuinely interested in curbing special interest influence.
That's the conclusion they draw. No real interest is the phrase they use.
And the issue flagged is the failure to fill government jobs.
Yeah, they call it the slowest transition in decades. An unprecedented number of key posts left empty.
Especially at the State Department.
Madeleine Albright apparently called the lack of senior diplomats there a national emergency.
And compared to past presidents at the one-year mark.
Significantly fewer Senate-confirmed nominees were in place across the board, according to the report.
And they list specific unfilled roles.
Oh, yeah. Chief financial officers, inspectors general, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, tons of ambassadorships to key countries. Just vacant.
And the report mentions President Trump himself suggesting this was somewhat intentional.
Right, statements to Forbes and Fox News where he indicated he didn't think many of these jobs were necessary.
But the report argues this neglects a core constitutional duty.
Yes, the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, which requires having people in place to actually do that.
Okay, let's talk about the cabinet itself. The report describes it as ethically challenged.
Rife with ethics problems and conflicts of interest is the phrasing.
They mention Treasury Secretary Mnuchin.
Retaining his position at a company with undisclosed investments, even after divesting other assets. Potential ongoing conflicts.
And Tom Price, HHS Secretary, who resigned.
Over his use of expensive private jets, costing taxpayers hundreds of thousands. A clear ethics lapse cited by the report.
Were there others mentioned?
Wilbur Ross at Commerce, with investments reportedly linked to a sanctioned Russian oligarch while he was negotiating trade with China.
And Rick Perry at Energy.
Proposing a plan that could have benefited a major coal donor, Bob Murray, though that plan ultimately didn't go through.
So the report suggests the president's own ethical standards, or lack thereof, set a tone.
Yes, they conclude it set a deplorable tone for the administration.
The report then has a section called The Enemy Within. What's that about?
It argues that cabinet secretaries were actively working to, quote, methodically deconstruct the agencies they led.
Like Scott Pruitt at the EPA.
Who had sued the EPA many times before leading it. The report details him banning grant recipients from advisory boards, appointing industry figures instead, cutting staff.
And Rex Tillerson at State.
Overseeing a sharp drop in senior staff numbers, leaving many ambassadorships empty, as we mentioned.
Betsy DeVos at Education.
Staff cuts there raise concerns, according to the report, about handling things like student loans effectively.
And Ben Carson at HUD.
The report notes his lack of prior experience and a policy approach described as just doing the opposite of the previous administration, leading to perceived lack of direction.
And the overall trend was fewer employees across government.
In most cabinet departments, yes. The report sees this as a deliberate hobbling of the federal bureaucracy.
Okay, another angle. The alleged misuse of taxpayer money for personal gain.
This links back to him retaining ownership of his businesses.
Right. The report highlights his campaign spending money at Trump companies.
$12.8 million, nearly 10% of expenses, and this continued, they argue, into the presidency.
With government money spent during his frequent stays at his properties.
Yes, payments for Secret Service golf carts at Bedminster, rent at Trump Tower, costs at Mar-a-Lago, taxpayer funds going to his businesses.
And the report points out indirect benefits, too.
Like Mar-a-Lago doubling its membership fees after the election, benefiting him directly.
Or the Trump Hotel in D.C. hiking rates.
Exactly. And then there's the use of political funds for legal bills.
RNC money and campaign funds paying lawyers for the Mueller probe for him and Donald Trump Jr.
Reportedly hundreds of thousands of dollars. The report calls this unusual and argues it all adds up to using public office for private enrichment.
The report also touches on the 2020 census. What were the concerns there?
That the administration was undermining the process needed for an accurate count.
Which is crucial for funding and representation, right?
Absolutely. The report points to proposed budget cuts for census preparations,
Cancellation of important field tests due to lack of funds.
the potential appointment of Thomas Brunel, known for controversial views on gerrymandering, to a top census post.
And, maybe most significantly, the push to add a citizenship question.
Which the report argues could depress participation, especially in immigrant communities, leading to an inaccurate count and unfair resource allocation for years.
Okay, another major theme. Trump attacks on the rule of law.
Here, the report argues his actions suggest he sees the rule of law as, quote, non-existent when applied to him.
Citing attempts to influence the Justice Department.
Yes, pressure on Sessions, on Comey, for personal or political reasons.
And his statement about having an absolute right to control the DOJ.
Which the report calls fundamentally wrong and contrary to post-Watergate norms of DOJ independence.
Plus, his public calls to prosecute political opponents like Huma Abedin.
Breaking with that tradition of presidents staying out of specific prosecution decisions.
And the attacks on judges we already discussed fit here, too.
Yes, the report loops those back in as undermining the judicial branch and the rule of law overall. They call it a dangerous path.
Closely related are the attacks on the press.
Which the report calls a dangerous attack on a fundamental principle of American democracy.
They list quite a few examples here.
Starting right at the beginning with the inauguration crowd-size claims.
Sean Spicer's statements. Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts.
Scaling back press briefings, the nearly 1,000 critical tweets about the press in the first year.
Calling journalists enemies of the American people.
Retweeting a doctored video showing him attacking CNN, threats to sue news outlets or poll licenses.
Calling reporters dishonest even during a visit to the CIA.
And targeting individual reporters personally, Megyn Kelly, Scarborough and Brzezinski, Jim Acosta.
The report includes a warning from Bob Schieffer.
The veteran journalist, yeah. Warning that the goal of such attacks is to destroy media credibility so people won't know who to believe, undermining democracy itself.
Okay, there's also a section on broader assaults on institutions and public officials.
Described as nonstop, often vicious personal attacks.
We've touched on some Comey, Sessions, the FBI.
Right. Calling the FBI worst in history tatters, accusing an agent of treason.
Attacking former intelligence chiefs Brennan and Clapper as political hacks.
Siding with Putin over his own intelligence agencies on election interference.
Irregular attacks on judges and the courts.
And attacks on members of Congress, including Republicans. The report cites a stat about him attacking nearly 1 in 5 GOP senators.
And mentions a specific attack on Senator Dick Durbin.
They quote legal scholar Jack Goldsmith, warning this weakens public confidence in all these institutions.
And the report concludes this damages trust, demoralizes officials, and harms America's global standing.
It's a broad critique of the impact of this rhetoric.
Another transparency issue, keeping White House visitor logs secret.
Yes, a direct reversal of the Obama administration's policy.
Obama released them, arguing the public had a right to know who was influencing policy.
Nearly 6 million records released over his terms. The Trump administration decided not to release them unless forced by courts.
Making it harder to see who had access and influence.
Exactly. Limited data obtained through lawsuits suggested visitors were heavily weighted towards white, male, Republican business executives.
Leading Newsweek, as cited in the report, to say his agenda seemed driven by business interests.
And the report argues this secrecy flies in the face of the Drain the Swamp pledge.
Then there's the issue of his tax returns.
A long-standing norm, right. Presidents releasing them since Truman, essentially.
And Trump had promised he would if he ran.
But he never did, throughout the campaign or his first year, even after the tax law passed.
Some limited info leaked out, but no voluntary full release.
And his reason, the ongoing IRS audit, was directly contradicted by the IRS itself, according to the report.
He later said only reporters cared. And Kellyanne Conway confirmed they wouldn't be released because people didn't care.
The report views this refusal as showing contempt for the norms of the American presidency and his fellow citizens.
Okay, getting near the end of the report's points. The Pence-Kobach Voter Fraud Commission.
Set up, the report argues, to justify Trump's false claims about millions of illegal votes in 2016.
Led by Pence and Chris Kobach, who was known for pushing restrictive voting laws.
The commission was stacked with partisans, the report says, and seemed aimed at finding ways to make voting harder, not easier or more secure.
It ran into trouble pretty quickly, didn't it?
Major pushback, including bipartisan opposition when it demanded sensitive voter data from all states, Lawsuits were filed.
Concerns about privacy and potential misuse of data.
And cybersecurity risks. Even one of the commission members sued over lack of transparency within the commission itself. It was shut down in early 2018.
So the report sees it as a distraction.
A distraction from finding real solutions for election security and access, yes.
Then there were the deregulatory task forces operating in secret.
Right. Trump ordered agencies to create these teams to review regulations for repeal or changes.
But how they operated was the issue.
Largely out of public view, according to a New York Times ProPublica investigation cited in the report.
And often staffed by political appointees with industry ties.
Yes, raising potential conflicts of interest. Many agencies wouldn't even disclose who is on these teams.
The investigation found former lobbyists working on rules affecting the industries they used to represent.
Numerous examples, like Samantha Dravis at EPA and Rebecca Adcock at the Department of Agriculture.
Prompting concern from lawmakers like Rep. Elijah Cummings about the lack of transparency.
Yet, President Trump touted these efforts as major regulatory reform, citing environmental and contraceptive rule changes.
One more point the report raises. President Trump personally interviewing U.S. attorney candidates.
Which the report calls a break from tradition. U.S. attorneys oversee federal cases, potentially including ones involving the president or his businesses.
Usually, the DOJ vets candidates, consults with senators.
Right. The concern is that personal interviews, especially after reports of demanding loyalty, could create an appearance of corruption or favoritism.
Preet Bharara, the former U.S. attorney Trump fired, called it neither normal nor advisable.
And the report mentions Trump nominating Jeffrey Berman, a former law partner of Rudy Giuliani, after a personal interview for the powerful Southern District of New York.
And his apparent keen interest in specific districts like Manhattan.
It raises questions about maintaining the independence of federal prosecutors.
Finally, the report looks at the Presidential Inaugural Committee funds.
A huge fundraising haul, $107 million, more than double Obama's second inauguration.
With big donations from corporations and wealthy individuals who reportedly got special access.
But very little transparency about how that money was spent. The committee isn't subject to strict disclosure rules.
There's a huge surplus, right, after event costs.
Estimated $79 million left over. They promised to donate it to charity.
But only a fraction was accounted for.
Only $3 million reported donated for hurricane relief initially. Watchdog groups asked for a full accounting of the spending and the rest of the surplus.
And got no response?
No response reported at the time the report was published. More questions about transparency and potential influence.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to cover from just the first year. So bringing it all together.
Yeah, this deep dive into the report from Common Cause and Democracy 21 really paints a picture, doesn't it? A pattern, they argue, of unprecedented actions related to truthfulness.
The rule of law, conflicts of interest, basic accountability.
Across many different areas of government during that first year.
And some things really stick out, like the sheer volume of claims the report labels false.
Or the very direct statements and actions surrounding the obstruction concerns.
The personal nature of the attacks on judges just for doing their jobs.
And the secrecy around things like the visitor logs or those deregulatory task forces.
Yeah.
They offer really stark examples of what the report is discussing.
So for you listening, looking at these documented instances sourced from public records by these nonpartisan groups.
It really provides valuable context, doesn't it, for thinking about government integrity, how democratic institutions are supposed to function, and the pressures they faced.
And maybe that leads us to a final thought, something for you to chew on.
Okay.
Given this report's detailed account of what it sees as major breaks from past norms and practices, just in that first year, what might be the long-term implications for the health, for the stability of American democracy if patterns like these were to continue or, just become normalized?
That is definitely a big question to ponder. What does it mean if the ground rules seem to shift?
Exactly. Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.